Hey everyone, thanks for joining me today. We're going to do a deep dive into a significant economic and energy story that's been unfolding in California, the closure of Valero's Benicia Refinery. This affects gas prices, hundreds of jobs, and raises fundamental questions about energy infrastructure, economic transitions, and how we balance competing priorities in the most populous state in the country. This is going to be a longer video because this story deserves more than surface level coverage. We'll look at the economics, the policy dimensions, the human impact, and what this tells us about energy transitions happening across the country. So grab a coffee, settle in, and let's break down what's actually happening here. Let me start with the basic facts and then we'll build out from there. Valero Energy Corporation announced they're shutting down their refinery in Benicia, California. That's in the Bay Area, about 30 miles northeast of San Francisco, by April 2026. This is a 145,000 barrel per day facility that's been operating since World War II. We're talking about a refinery that was built in 1943, originally by Shell Oil, to support the war effort. Now, if you're not familiar with refinery capacity metrics, let me put that 145,000 barrels per day in perspective. That translates to about 6.1 million gallons of gasoline and other petroleum products every single day. To give you a sense of scale, that's roughly 3.4% of California's total refining capacity. It's not the biggest refinery in the state. That would be Chevron's facility in Richmond, but it's substantial. This isn't happening in isolation, and that's crucial to understand. Phillips 66 closed their Los Angeles refinery at the end of 2025. That was a 139,000 barrel per day facility. So California is losing nearly 300,000 barrels per day of refining capacity within a span of just a few months. That's significant. Before these closures, California had about 1.8 million barrels per day of refining capacity across 11 facilities. We're now looking at a roughly 15% reduction in a very short time frame. The human cost here is real and immediate. 237 workers will lose their jobs between March 15th and July 1st, according to Valero's notice to the California Employment Development Department. These aren't entry-level positions. We're talking about skilled operators, process engineers, maintenance technicians, safety specialists, many of whom have spent decades, sometimes entire careers, at this facility. The average refinery worker in California earns between $80,000 and $120,000 annually with benefits. These are solid middle-class jobs. Let me give you some historical context on this facility specifically. The Benicia refinery has changed hands several times over its 80-year history. Shell built it, then it was sold to Exxon, then to Ultramar, then to Valero in 2000. Each transition involved upgrades and modifications. Valero invested hundreds of millions of dollars over the years to meet California's increasingly stringent environmental standards and to process heavier crude oils. The human cost here is real and immediate. 237 workers will lose their jobs between March 15th and July 1st, according to Valero's notice to the California Employment Development Department. These aren't entry-level positions. We're talking about skilled operators, process engineers, maintenance technicians, safety specialists, many of whom have spent decades, sometimes entire careers, at this facility. The average refinery worker in California earns between $80,000 and $120,000 annually with benefits. These are solid middle-class jobs. Let me give you some historical context on this facility specifically. The Benicia refinery has changed hands several times over its 80-year history. Shell built it, then it was sold to Exxon, then to Ultramar, then to Valero in 2000. Each transition involved upgrades and modifications. Valero invested hundreds of millions of dollars over the years to meet California's increasingly stringent environmental standards and to process heavier crude oils. In 2013, Valero proposed a crude by rail project that would have allowed the refinery to receive up to 70,000 barrels per day of North American crude by train. That project was ultimately rejected by the Benicia City Council in 2016 after intense opposition from environmental groups and concerns about rail safety, especially after several high-profile oil train derailments. That rejection limited the refinery's feedstock flexibility and likely affected its long-term economics. So let's dig into the economics here because this is really what drives these decisions. Valero first announced this closure decision back in April 2025. In their statement to investors and in their notice to the California Energy Commission, they've been carefully using language about evaluating strategic alternatives and challenging market conditions. Let me translate that corporate speak into what's actually happening. First, there's the age and condition of the facility. An 80-year-old refinery requires constant, expensive maintenance. We're talking about pressure vessels, distillation columns, piping systems, electrical infrastructure, all of which have finite lifespans. At a certain point, you're looking at hundreds of millions of dollars in capital investment just to keep the lights on, let alone modernize. California also has some of the strictest environmental and safety regulations in the country. Now, before anyone jumps into the comments, I'm not making a judgment here about whether those regulations are good or bad. That's a separate discussion. What I'm saying is they exist, they're stricter than most other states, and compliance requires ongoing investment. For example, California's cap and trade program puts a price on carbon emissions. Refineries are major emitters, so they're buying carbon allowances. That's a cost that refineries in Texas or Louisiana don't face. California also has stricter air quality standards, water discharge standards, and safety requirements. Second, California's unique fuel specifications. This is really important and often misunderstood. California requires a special gasoline blend, often called CARBOB, which stands for California Reformulated Gasoline Blend Stock for Oxygenate Blending. It's designed to burn cleaner and reduce smog formation. The problem is you can't just import regular gasoline from other states or countries and sell it in California. It has to meet these specific formulations. That means California refineries have somewhat of a captive market. They're producing for a specific customer base that can't easily be served by outside competition. But it also means higher production costs and significant capital investment in the specific equipment needed to produce this fuel. Third, and this is the most telling part, Valero actively tried to sell this refinery and couldn't find a buyer at any price. Think about that for a moment. This isn't a case where Valero just decided to shut it down on a whim. They went looking for someone else who thought they could make it profitable. They found no one. What does that tell you? It tells you that sophisticated energy companies with teams of analysts looked at the Benicia refinery's economics, the capital investment needed, the operating costs, the regulatory environment, the market outlook, and concluded it wasn't worth buying even at a steep discount. Marathon Petroleum sold their Martinez refinery, also in the Bay Area, in 2020 to PBF Energy. But that was a larger, more modern facility. The Benicia refinery apparently didn't attract similar interest. Fourth, let's talk about the long-term market outlook. California has set aggressive climate targets, carbon neutrality by 2045, and perhaps most significantly for refineries, a ban on sales of new gas-powered cars starting in 2035. That's only 9 years away now. If you're Valero's executive team looking at an 80-year-old refinery that needs, let's say conservatively, $500 million in upgrades to operate for another 20 years, and you're looking at a market that's explicitly planning to dramatically reduce gasoline consumption starting in less than a decade, that's a very difficult business case to make to your shareholders. Now, I want to be clear. Gasoline demand isn't falling off a cliff tomorrow. California still has about 30 million registered vehicles, and roughly 27 million of them are still gas-powered. The transition to electric vehicles is happening, but it's gradual. Current EV adoption is around 10% of new car sales in California, higher than anywhere else in the country, but still a minority. But if you're making a major capital investment decision today, you're thinking 15, 20 years out. And that's where the uncertainty becomes really challenging for the business case. Finally, there's the profitability issue. Refining margins. The difference between what you pay for crude oil and what you sell refined products for are notoriously volatile. In 2022, during the post-pandemic supply crunch, refiners made record profits. In 2020, some were losing money. California refineries have historically had higher margins than the national average because of that captive market I mentioned, but they also have higher costs. When margins compress, those high fixed costs become really problematic. Valero is a publicly traded company. They answer to shareholders. If the Benicia refinery wasn't meeting their return on investment thresholds and the outlook suggested it wouldn't improve, shutting it down and reallocating that capital to more profitable operations elsewhere is what they're expected to do. That's capitalism functioning as designed. Whether that's the right framework for managing essential energy infrastructure is a legitimate policy question, but that's the system we're operating in. All right, let's get to what most people watching this really want to know. What does this mean for gas prices? The short answer is upward pressure on prices, especially in Northern California, but the magnitude is genuinely uncertain and depends on several factors. Let me break this down systematically. Supply and demand basics. When you remove 145,000 barrels per day of local refining capacity from a market, and demand stays relatively constant, economic theory says prices should rise. That's Econ 101. But the real world is more complicated than Econ 101. Factor 1, Valero's import commitment. Valero has publicly committed to continue supplying gasoline to Northern California even after the refinery closes. They'll be importing fuel from their other refineries. They operate 6 refineries in Texas and Louisiana, plus facilities in other states, and potentially from international sources. Governor Newsom's office specifically highlighted this in their January statement, saying this would help maintain steady supply and stable prices. That's the optimistic case. Supply continues just from different sources, so prices remain stable. But here's the problem with that scenario. Importing fuel is generally more expensive than refining it locally. You've got transportation costs, whether that's tanker ships from the Gulf Coast through the Panama Canal or from overseas refineries. You've got terminal costs, storage costs, and you're now exposed to international market prices rather than local production costs. A study by the California Energy Commission estimated that these refinery closures could add between 15 and 47 cents per gallon to gas prices, with the higher end of that range occurring during supply disruptions or peak demand periods. Factor 2, California already has the highest gas prices in the continental United States. As of early February 2026, the average price in California is around $4.65 per gallon, compared to a national average of about $3.20. Why the difference? Several reasons. The special fuel blend I mentioned earlier, higher state taxes, cap and trade costs, and generally higher operating costs in California. So we're starting from an already elevated baseline. Adding another 50 cents on top of that means Northern California could be looking at regular unleaded pushing $5 or $5.50 per gallon, potentially higher during summer driving season. Factor 3, supply chain vulnerability. Right now, California refineries supply California consumers. It's a relatively short supply chain. When you're importing fuel from the Gulf Coast or from overseas, you've added complexity and vulnerability. What happens if there's a hurricane in the Gulf that shuts down refineries there? What if there's a shipping disruption? What if geopolitical tensions affect international fuel markets? California becomes more exposed to those external shocks when it's more dependent on imports. During the summer of 2022, we saw this play out. California gas prices spiked to over $6 per gallon in some areas, partly because of refinery maintenance downtime and supply constraints. With less local refining capacity as a buffer, those kinds of spikes could become more common or more severe. Factor 4, and this is important, demand is slowly declining. California's gasoline consumption peaked around 2005, 2007, and has been gradually declining since then. People are driving more fuel-efficient vehicles, more people work remotely, at least part-time, and EV adoption is accelerating. The California Energy Commission projects that gasoline demand will decline by about 20-30% by 2035 as the state's climate policies take effect. So you've got decreasing supply from these refinery closures, but also gradually decreasing demand. How those two curves intersect will determine the actual price impact. If demand falls faster than expected, maybe EV adoption accelerates, maybe remote work becomes more permanent, maybe gas prices themselves cause people to change behavior, then we might not see dramatic price increases. But if demand stays stubborn, or if we hit supply disruptions before demand has declined significantly, we could see painful price spikes. Factor 5: market competition and pricing behavior. This gets into murkier territory. California Attorney General Rob Bonta has been investigating whether refiners engage in price gouging or market manipulation. With fewer refineries operating, there's less competition, which theoretically could allow remaining refiners to charge higher prices. The petroleum industry strongly disputes this, arguing that California's prices reflect the genuine costs of operating in a high-regulation environment. They point to the fact that California refiners don't make dramatically higher profits than refiners elsewhere, despite higher prices. This is genuinely hard to untangle. Are high prices due to high costs and constrained supply, or due to insufficient competition? Probably some of both, depending on market conditions at any given time. One thing that's clear: when you go from 11 refineries to 9 refineries in a market, you have fewer competitors. Whether that translates to higher prices through reduced competition or just reflects capacity exiting an economically challenging market is the subject of legitimate debate. Now, we need to talk about the policy and political dimensions of this story because it's become intensely politicized. And honestly, the political debate often generates more heat than light. Let me try to map out the different perspectives fairly, because there are legitimate points on multiple sides. Perspective 1: California's regulations are driving refineries out of the state. This is the argument you'll hear from the petroleum industry, from Republican politicians, and from some economists. The basic case goes like this: California has layered regulation upon regulation on the petroleum industry. Environmental rules, climate policies, labor regulations, tax structures. Each one individually might be defensible, but cumulatively they make operating a refinery in California economically unviable compared to other states. The Western States Petroleum Association has been making this argument for years. They point out that building a new refinery in California is essentially impossible due to permitting challenges. So, as old refineries become uneconomical and close, there's no mechanism for new, more efficient capacity to replace them. They argue this creates a downward spiral. Regulations make refineries unprofitable, refineries close, supply tightens, prices rise, which creates political pressure for more price controls or regulations, which makes the economics even worse for the remaining refineries. Their preferred solution would be regulatory reform to make California more hospitable to refinery investment, or at minimum, to not add additional regulations that further squeeze the economics. There's data supporting some of this. California refineries do face costs that refineries in other states don't. The California Air Resources Board's regulations are stricter than federal EPA standards. The cap and trade program does add costs. Labor costs in California are higher. These are facts. Perspective 2: fossil fuel companies are making strategic exits as the energy transition accelerates. This is the argument you'll hear from environmental groups, from Democratic politicians like Governor Newsom, and from climate policy advocates. Their case goes like this: oil companies can see the writing on the wall. The energy transition is coming. California is just moving faster than other places. Rather than adapt, companies are making strategic decisions to exit the California market and reinvest in areas where they expect fossil fuel demand to persist longer. They point out that major oil companies are still making billions in profits globally. If Valero really wanted to make the Benicia refinery work, they could invest the capital needed. The fact that they're choosing not to suggests it's a strategic decision, not an economic necessity driven by regulation. Environmental groups argue that it's actually good that California is accelerating the decline of fossil fuel infrastructure, because that's necessary to meet climate goals. They'd rather see investment going into EV charging infrastructure, public transit, renewable energy, and green hydrogen rather than trying to prop up aging refineries. Their concern about the price impacts is real, but they argue the solution isn't to preserve fossil fuel infrastructure. It's to accelerate the transition to alternatives so people aren't dependent on gasoline in the first place. Perspective 3: this is a managed transition challenge, and California isn't managing it well. This is a more nuanced position that you might hear from economists, policy wonks, and some moderate politicians from both parties. The argument here acknowledges that California's climate goals are legitimate and probably necessary given the severity of climate change. But it also argues that you can't simply shut down existing infrastructure before alternatives are in place without causing significant economic pain, especially for working class and middle class families who are most affected by higher gas prices. From this perspective, the problem isn't California's climate goals per se, it's the lack of coordination between climate policy, which is reducing fuel demand, and energy policy, which needs to ensure affordable supply during the transition. For example, California is phasing out gas car sales by 2035, but we're closing refineries in 2026. That's a 9-year gap, where millions of Californians will still be driving gas-powered vehicles, but with less local refining capacity. That gap creates price risk. A better managed transition might have involved more aggressive EV incentives and charging infrastructure build-out to accelerate demand reduction requirements that refineries closing must ensure equivalent import capacity is in place. First, strategic petroleum reserves at the state level to buffer against supply shocks. More support for affected workers in terms of retraining and job placement. Coordination with labor unions to ensure the green jobs replacing fossil fuel jobs offer similar wages and benefits. The challenge is that managing transitions is really hard. It requires coordination across state agencies between public and private sectors and perfect timing. Markets don't work that neatly. The political reality? In California, this has become wrapped up in broader political fights. Republicans blame Democratic policies for high gas prices and see refinery closures as evidence of regulatory overreach. Democrats defend their climate policies and accuse oil companies of profiteering and blaming regulations for market decisions. Governor Newsom has tried to walk a middle line, defending California's climate goals while also investigating potential price gouging and pushing for continued fuel supply commitments from companies like Valero. The California legislature passed SB X12 in 2023, which requires refineries to notify the state of any planned shutdowns or major maintenance that could affect supply, and gives the California Energy Commission more oversight authority. That's what led to Valero's formal notification process. Some legislators have proposed going further, potentially requiring refineries to maintain minimum inventory levels or creating penalties for supply disruptions. The industry argues this would just accelerate the exit of refineries from the state. At the federal level, this hasn't been a major issue because energy policy is largely state level, but it does feed into broader national debates about climate policy, energy independence, and the pace of the energy transition. International context. It's worth noting that California isn't alone in facing these challenges. European countries are grappling with similar issues as they try to transition away from fossil fuels while maintaining affordable energy. The UK has seen refinery closures. Germany is dealing with the phase-out of coal and nuclear while ensuring reliable power. The difference is that Europe has more interconnected energy markets, so a refinery closing in one country can be more easily compensated by increased production or imports from neighbors. California is more geographically isolated. You're either refining locally or shipping from far away. Let me spend some time on something that often gets overlooked in these macro-level policy debates, what this means for actual people in Benicia and in the refinery workforce. 237 jobs doesn't sound like a huge number when you're talking about state-level policy, but in a city of about 27,000 people, that's nearly 1% of the entire population losing their jobs from a single employer. And that's just direct employment. Refineries have significant multiplier effects. For every direct refinery job, there are typically 2 to 3 indirect jobs in the local economy: contractors, suppliers, service providers, and the businesses that those workers patronize. So the real economic impact on Benicia is more like 600 to 700 jobs when you count ripple effects. These are well-paying jobs. The average refinery operator in California earns about $95,000 per year. Skilled technicians and engineers can earn $120,000, $150,000. These are careers that provide solid middle-class lives, homes, college funds for kids, retirement security. Valero has committed to providing severance packages and job placement assistance. Some workers will be able to transfer to other Valero facilities, but that means uprooting families, selling homes, moving to different states. For workers in their 50s and 60s, that's an incredibly difficult decision. Some workers closer to retirement might take early retirement packages, but for workers in their 30s and 40s, mid-career with mortgages and kids in school, this is genuinely disruptive. And here's the challenge. What replaces these jobs in the local economy? California's economy is strong overall. It's the fifth largest economy in the world. The tech sector is booming. Professional services, entertainment, agriculture, tourism. There are lots of jobs in California. But they're not the same jobs. A refinery operator with 20 years of experience has specialized skills that are valuable in that industry, but don't necessarily translate directly to other sectors. Retraining is possible, but it takes time, money, and often results in lower wages initially. The just transition concept has become a key part of climate policy discussions. The idea is that we shouldn't ask workers in fossil fuel industries to bear the cost of necessary climate action. Instead, we should provide support for retraining, job placement, income support during transitions, and ensure that green economy jobs offer similar wages and working conditions. That sounds great in principle. In practice, it's much harder. The Biden administration has been promoting green jobs, manufacturing solar panels, building wind turbines, installing EV chargers, retrofitting buildings for energy efficiency. Those are real jobs, but they're not necessarily in the same locations, don't always pay the same, and require different skills. Some labor unions have been critical of the just transition promises, arguing that green jobs often pay less and have weaker union representation than traditional industrial jobs like refinery work. California has programs designed to help with these transitions: the Employment Training Panel, various community college retraining programs, displaced worker programs, but the track record is mixed. Some workers successfully transition to new careers. Others end up in lower-paying jobs or leave the workforce entirely. For Benicia specifically, the city will lose significant tax revenue from the refinery. Property taxes, business taxes, and the general economic activity generated by those high-wage jobs contribute to the city's budget. That affects schools, public services, infrastructure maintenance. The city has been trying to diversify its economy for years, knowing this day might come. There's been some success attracting other businesses, developing the waterfront, promoting tourism, but losing your largest industrial employer is still a significant blow. Let's zoom out and think about what this means for energy transitions more broadly, because California is essentially a test case that the rest of the country and other nations are watching. The timing mismatch problem. One of the fundamental challenges in energy transitions is that you can't simply turn off old infrastructure and turn on new infrastructure simultaneously. There are necessarily gaps and overlaps. Right now, we're in a period where gasoline demand is declining but still substantial, while refinery capacity is declining faster. That creates a mismatch. Eventually, as EV adoption accelerates, demand will fall to match the reduced supply. But in the interim period, maybe 5-10 years, there's potential for supply-demand imbalances that create price volatility. This isn't unique to California or to petroleum. Germany faced similar issues when they rapidly closed nuclear plants after Fukushima, while their renewable capacity wasn't yet sufficient to fill the gap. They ended up burning more coal temporarily and importing more Russian natural gas, outcomes that undermine their climate goals. The ideal transition would have perfect synchronization. As gasoline demand falls, refinery capacity decreases proportionally, prices stay stable, workers smoothly transition to new jobs, and alternative infrastructure comes online exactly when needed. Real life isn't that neat. The infrastructure investment challenge. California needs massive investment in EV charging infrastructure to support its 2035 goals. We're talking tens of thousands of fast charging stations, hundreds of thousands of level 2 chargers, electrical grid upgrades to handle increased power demand, and ensuring charging availability in low-income communities and rural areas. That investment is happening, but it's not happening as fast as vehicle policy is changing. There's a real risk of creating an affordability crisis where working-class families can't afford new EVs, but also can't afford to fuel their gas cars because prices are high due to supply constraints. This is sometimes called the middle transition squeeze, the period where the old system is declining, but the new system isn't fully built out yet, and people get caught in the gap. The geographic equity question. Energy transitions affect different communities very differently. Urban areas with good public transit, shorter commutes, and higher incomes can transition to EVs more easily. Rural areas with longer distances, limited charging infrastructure, and lower incomes face bigger challenges. Northern California has some very rural areas. Think far northern counties like Modoc or Siskiyou, where EV charging infrastructure is sparse, distances are long, and many residents can't afford $50,000 electric vehicles. If gas prices spike to $6 or $7 per gallon due to refinery closures, that's genuinely economically devastating for those communities. This creates political backlash that can undermine support for climate policies overall. We've seen this in other contexts. The Yellow Vest protests in France were partially triggered by fuel taxes that hit rural and working-class people hardest. The energy security dimension. When California was more self-sufficient in refining, it had more control over its energy security. With greater dependence on imports, the state becomes more vulnerable to external shocks. What happens if there's a major hurricane that shuts down Gulf Coast refineries for weeks? What if there's geopolitical instability that affects global fuel markets? What if there's a West Coast port strike that disrupts imports? These aren't hypothetical scenarios. They've all happened before in various forms. California's energy resilience is potentially decreasing during the transition period. Some argue this creates a case for strategic petroleum reserves at the state level, similar to the federal Strategic Petroleum Reserve. California could stockpile fuel to release during supply disruptions, but that requires investment and storage infrastructure. The lesson for other jurisdictions, other states and countries are watching California carefully. If California successfully manages this transition, maintaining affordable energy while reducing emissions and creating good green jobs, it becomes a model that others can follow. If California struggles, if prices spike, reliability suffers, workers are left behind, and political backlash undermines climate policies, it becomes a cautionary tale that slows transitions elsewhere. So there's enormous significance to whether California gets this right. It's not just about California, it's about demonstrating that rapid energy transitions are feasible without unacceptable economic disruption. Right now, the jury is still out. California has made remarkable progress on clean energy. About 45% of electricity now comes from renewables. EV adoption is leading the nation. Emissions have declined even as the economy has grown. Those are real achievements. But the challenges are real too. High energy costs, infrastructure gaps, workforce transition difficulties, and equity concerns. How California addresses these challenges over the next 5-10 years will be instructive for climate policy globally. So what should we be paying attention to as this story continues to develop? First, gas prices in Northern California, especially from April through September 2026. If Valero's import strategy successfully maintains supply, prices should stay relatively stable with modest increases. If there are supply hiccups, we could see significant spikes. Summer is particularly vulnerable because that's peak driving season with highest demand. Second, California Energy Commission reporting. The CEC is required to monitor fuel supply and pricing. They publish regular reports. If you want to track this with real data rather than political spin from either side, the CEC reports are your best source. Third, employment and economic impacts in Benicia and Solano County. Local news outlets will be tracking what happens to displaced workers, whether promised job placement assistance actually materializes, and how the local economy adapts. This is where the human story continues to unfold. Fourth, policy responses from Sacramento. Will the California legislature pass additional regulations on remaining refineries? Will they create new programs to support displaced workers? Will there be investigations into pricing behavior? State capital reporting will be important here. Fifth, EV adoption rates and charging infrastructure build-out. The faster California can reduce gasoline demand through EV adoption, the less painful these refinery closures become. But that requires actual infrastructure. Track the numbers on public charging stations, especially in underserved areas, and EV sales data. Sixth, watch for any additional refinery closure announcements. The remaining 9 California refineries are all evaluating their economics in this same environment. If we see another major closure announcement in the next 12-24 months, that would suggest the pressures driving Valero's decision are widespread. That would significantly amplify all the challenges we've discussed. Seventh, legal or regulatory developments. Are there lawsuits related to environmental permits? Are there challenges to California's climate policies? Are there federal preemption issues? The legal landscape could affect how this plays out. Eighth, look at other states' responses. Are other states learning from California's experience? Are they accelerating their own transitions, or are they taking a more cautious approach? Interstate policy diffusion is a real phenomenon, and California often serves as a policy laboratory for the nation. Let me wrap this up with some final thoughts. The Valero Benicia refinery closure is significant not just for the specific impacts, 237 jobs lost, potential gas price increases, reduced refining capacity, but for what it represents about the challenges of managing large-scale economic and energy transitions. This is genuinely complex, and anyone who tells you it's simple, whether they're saying regulations are killing jobs or fossil fuel companies are just greedy, isn't giving you the full picture. There are legitimate concerns across multiple dimensions here. Workers are losing good jobs, and we need to take seriously our obligation to help them transition rather than just expecting them to figure it out on their own. Consumers face potentially higher costs, and that disproportionately affects people with lower incomes who spend a bigger share of their budget on transportation. Energy security and supply reliability matter. Imports work until they don't, and increasing dependence on distant supply chains creates vulnerabilities. Climate change is real, urgent, and requires transitions away from fossil fuels. Delay creates larger costs down the road. Local communities like Benicia are dealing with economic disruption and tax revenue losses that affect schools and services. California is trying to lead on climate policy while maintaining economic vitality, and the learning curve is steep. All of these concerns are valid. The challenge is balancing them. I think there are some lessons emerging. First, transitions take longer and are messier than policy frameworks often assume. The gap between closing refineries and full EV adoption is real and creates real problems. Planning for those interim periods is crucial. Second, just transition support needs to be robust and early. Promises of help for displaced workers ring hollow if the actual programs are underfunded or poorly designed. This requires real resources and sustained commitment. Third, energy infrastructure is critical infrastructure. Whether it should be managed purely by private market decisions or whether there's a role for more public planning is a legitimate debate. The current approach, private companies making economic decisions within a regulatory framework, creates these kinds of mismatches. Fourth, equity has to be central. If energy transitions create a two-tier system where wealthy people can afford EVs and charging infrastructure while working-class people are stuck paying 6-gallon for gas in aging vehicles, that's not just unfair, it's politically unsustainable. Fifth, we need better data and transparency. The debates about whether high prices reflect genuine costs or market power, whether regulations are appropriate or excessive, whether transitions are happening too fast or too slow, all of these would benefit from better public information and less politicized analysis. I'll keep following this story. The real-world impacts will become clear over the next 6 to 12 months. This is one of those situations where theories and projections meet reality, and we'll learn a lot about what works and what doesn't in managing energy transitions. If you're interested in going deeper, I've put links in the description to The California Energy Commission's refinery closure monitoring page, Valero's investor statements and notices to the state local reporting from the Benicia Herald and San Francisco Chronicle California Air Resources Board, data on gasoline demand trends, academic research on just transitions and energy policy. I'd especially encourage you to seek out diverse sources. Read what the petroleum industry is saying, read what environmental groups are saying, read what independent economists are saying, and read what affected workers and communities are saying. The truth is usually somewhere in the complexity of all those perspectives together. Thanks for sticking with me through this longer analysis. I know 20 plus minutes is a lot to ask, but I think this story deserves more than sound bites. Let me know in the comments what you think, especially if you have local knowledge or if you're affected by this directly. I'm genuinely interested in hearing from refinery workers dealing with these transitions, Benicia residents seeing their community change, people working on EV infrastructure build out, anyone in other states or countries dealing with similar energy transition challenges. Real experiences and ground level perspectives add a lot to understanding these issues beyond the policy abstractions. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.